The dusty streets of Evanston, Wyoming territory, had never heard an accent quite like Josephine Ellis's, and the townsfolk made certain she knew it every single day since her arrival in the spring of 1878. Josephine had traveled from Cornwall, England, after her father's mining accident left her orphaned and alone. Her uncle, a shopkeeper in Evanston, had written to her mother years ago, extending an invitation to come to America should they ever need a fresh start. When tragedy struck, Josephine cashed in what little inheritance remained and bought passage across the Atlantic, then rattled westward on the transcontinental railroad until she reached this growing town along the Union Pacific Line. She had expected opportunity. She had expected challenges. What she had not expected was the constant ridicule. "Speak English. Why don't you?" Mrs. Patterson would snap whenever Josephine tried to purchase fabric at the general store. The older woman's face would scrunch up in exaggerated confusion, though Josephine knew perfectly well that her words were clear enough. At the boarding house where she took her meals, other residents would mimic her rounded vowels and the melodic lilt that marked her as Cornish. They would lean into each other and whisper, then burst into laughter when she passed. Even children on the street would call after her, mangling her accent into something unrecognizable and cruel. Her uncle meant well, but he was a quiet, defeated sort of man whose own shop barely turned a profit. He had no influence in town, no way to shield his niece from the casual cruelty of people who viewed anything different as something to be mocked. Josephine held her head high, repeated her carefully practiced American phrases, and tried to soften the edges of her speech. It never seemed to be enough. She found work at the Evanston Hotel, cleaning rooms and changing linens for travelers passing through. The work was honest but exhausting, and her hands grew rough from lye soap and constant scrubbing. The hotel manager, Mr. Griffith, was fair enough, though he had asked her upon hiring whether she could talk normal around the guests. She had assured him she would try. It was a scorching afternoon in July when everything changed. Josephine was hauling a basket of soiled linens down the hotel's back stairs when she heard the familiar sound of mockery drifting from the saloon across the way. 3 men sat on the wooden sidewalk, bottles in hand, and one of them was doing a theatrical impression of her asking for directions the previous week. "Excuse me, sir, but where might I find the apothecary?" The man drawled in a ridiculous falsetto, his mouth contorted. His companions howled with laughter, slapping their knees. Josephine's cheeks burned. She kept walking, eyes fixed straight ahead, willing herself not to cry until she reached the privacy of the laundry room. But as she passed the saloon, one of the men called out to her directly. "Hey there, English girl, say something for us." She quickened her pace, the heavy basket bumping against her hip. "Come on, just one word. We want to hear that funny voice." The laughter followed her around the corner, echoing off the false-fronted buildings that lined Main Street. She finally reached the small building behind the hotel where the washing was done and set down her burden with shaking hands. Hot tears spilled over, and she wiped them away angrily. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent. She had buried her parents and started a new life with nothing but determination and the clothes on her back. She would not let these people break her. But oh, how it hurt. That evening, after her shift ended, Josephine walked to the little room she rented above her uncle's shop. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her achingly of the sunsets over the Cornish coast. She was so lost in memory that she nearly collided with a man coming out of the saddle shop. "Pardon me," she murmured, stepping aside. The man touched the brim of his hat. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His eyes were a striking gray-green like sage after rain. "My fault, miss. I was not watching where I was going." Josephine recognized him vaguely. He worked at one of the ranches outside town, she thought. She had seen him occasionally, bringing horses in or picking up supplies, but they had never spoken. She nodded politely and moved to continue on her way. "You are Miss Ellis, are you not?" She turned back, surprised. "I am." "Quinton Vaughn." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she shook it. His grip was firm but gentle, calloused from hard work. "I work at the Double Creek Ranch about 10 miles north. I have seen you around town." "Have you?" She could not quite keep the wariness from her voice. Was this another person preparing to mock her? But Quinton's expression remained open and friendly. "I have. You work at the hotel?" "Yes, I do." An awkward silence stretched between them. Josephine was accustomed to conversations dying quickly once people heard her speak. She prepared herself for the usual reaction. The barely concealed smile, the exchanged glance with whoever else was nearby, the sudden need to be elsewhere. Instead, Quinton said, "I hope you are finding Evanston to your liking." "It is." "An adjustment," she said carefully. He nodded, seeming to understand what she was not saying. Towns like this can be rough on newcomers. Folks get set in their ways, forget that they were all strangers here once too. He paused, then added, "I am sorry if people have been unkind." The unexpected sympathy nearly undid her composure. She swallowed hard. "That is kind of you to say. It is only the truth." Quinton shifted his weight, and she noticed he carried a new bridle over one shoulder. "Well, I should let you get on with your evening. It was a pleasure to meet you properly, Miss Ellis. And you, Mr. Vaughn." He tipped his hat again and walked toward where his horse was tied in front of the general store. Josephine continued to her uncle's shop, feeling oddly lighter despite the day's earlier humiliations. Someone had been kind. Someone had noticed her struggles and offered a word of understanding. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt enormous. Over the next few weeks, Josephine found herself encountering Quinton Vaughn with surprising frequency. He would be at the general store when she stopped in for thread. She would see him watering his horse at the public trough when she walked to work. Once, he held the door of the post office open for her, and they had a brief conversation about the weather and how different Wyoming was from Cornwall. She learned that he had come to Wyoming from Missouri 5 years earlier, that he was 24 years old, and that he had worked his way up from ranch hand to foreman at the Double Creek. He was quiet and thoughtful, choosing his words with care, and he never once made her feel foolish for the way she spoke. It was early August when everything shifted again. Josephine was sweeping the front steps of the hotel when a group of young men rode past, kicking up dust. One of them, a banker's son named Frank who had tormented her since her arrival, reined in his horse directly in front of her. "Good morning, lady," he called in an exaggerated British accent, though her Cornish speech sounded nothing like what he was attempting. "Might I trouble you for a spot of tea?" His friends circled their horses, laughing. Josephine tightened her grip on the broom handle and said nothing. "What is the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you just do not speak American?" "I speak perfectly well," Josephine said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Perhaps if you opened your ears instead of your mouth you would hear that." Frank's face reddened. He was not accustomed to her fighting back. Before he could respond, another horse approached at a measured walk. Quinton Vaughn rode up beside Frank's mount, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "Morning, Frank. I think you are blocking the lady's way." Frank bristled. "We were just having a conversation, Vaughn. Nothing to do with you." "Seems to me the conversation was one-sided." Quinton's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "And seems to me you and your friends have somewhere else to be." The two men stared at each other. Frank was younger, brasher, but Quinton had the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to prove himself. After a long moment, Frank jerked his horse's head around. "Come on, boys. Nothing interesting here anyway." They galloped off, leaving Quinton and Josephine in a cloud of settling dust. Quinton dismounted and approached the steps. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." Josephine set the broom aside, brushing dust from her apron. "But thank you for intervening. You did not have to do that." "I know." He met her eyes directly. "I wanted to." Something in the way he said it made her heart skip. She looked away, suddenly flustered. "Would you like some water for your horse? There is a trough just around back." "That would be good, thank you." She walked with him to the back of the building, acutely aware of his presence beside her. The horse drank deeply while they stood in companionable silence. Finally, Quinton said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Your accent, the way you speak, it is beautiful. Why do you try to hide it?" Josephine blinked in surprise. "Beautiful. Most people here think it sounds ridiculous." "Most people here have never been more than 50 miles from where they were born," Quinton said. "They do not understand that different is not the same as wrong." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I wonder if you would consider teaching me." "Teaching you what?" "To speak like you do." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to learn my accent?" "I do." His expression was completely serious. "I have always wanted to travel to see more of the world than just Missouri and Wyoming. Learning how people speak in other places seems like a good start. And besides—" He smiled slightly. "Maybe if more people around here spoke like you would not stand out so much. Maybe if they tried it themselves, they would realize how foolish they have been." Josephine did not know what to say. In all the months of mockery and isolation, no one had ever suggested that her voice was something valuable, something worth learning rather than losing. Emotion swelled in her chest. "I do not know if I would be a very good teacher," she managed. "I think you would be an excellent teacher." Quinton's smile widened. "What do you say? Would you be willing to give it a try?" She found herself smiling back. "All right, yes, I could try." "Wonderful." He looked genuinely pleased. "I come into town most Saturdays for supplies. Perhaps we could meet then, maybe at the restaurant over lunch." "I would pay, of course, for your time and trouble." "You do not need to pay me," Josephine protested. "Then I will buy you lunch as thanks for the lesson." "Fair enough." She hesitated, then nodded. "Fair enough." That Saturday, Josephine dressed with more care than usual, telling herself it was simply because she was dining out, not because she would be seeing Quinton Vaughn. She chose her best dress, a simple but well-made blue cotton that brought out the green in her hazel eyes, and pinned her dark blonde hair into a neat bun. The restaurant was a modest establishment, but it served decent food and was respectable enough for a young woman to dine there without comment. Quinton was already waiting when she arrived, standing up immediately when he saw her approach. "Miss Ellis, thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation." They settled across from each other at a small table by the window. The lunch crowd had not yet arrived, giving them relative privacy. After they ordered, Josephine folded her hands in her lap and asked, "Where should we begin?" "Wherever you think best. You are the teacher here." She considered. "Well, I suppose I could start by explaining a bit about Cornwall. The way we speak there is influenced by both English and the old Cornish language, which is similar to Welsh and Breton. We have particular ways of pronouncing vowels and certain consonants that mark us as Cornish rather than from other parts of England." Quinton listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions. When their food arrived, Josephine found herself relaxing, talking more freely than she had since coming to Evanston. She told him about the fishing villages clinging to rocky cliffs, about the tin mines where her father had worked, about the wildflowers that bloomed on the moors in spring. Try saying harbor, she suggested, but soften the R, almost like it is not fully there. Harbor, like that. Harbor, Quinton repeated carefully, not bad, but let the vowel be rounder. Think of it as harbor. Harbor, better, she laughed, delighted. You have a good ear. They spent the rest of the meal practicing simple words and phrases. Quinton was a surprisingly dedicated student, focusing intently on the shape of her mouth and the rhythm of her speech. More than once, Josephine found herself blushing under his steady gaze, reminding herself that he was studying her accent, not her lips specifically. As they finished their coffee, Quinton said, "This was wonderful. Thank you truly. Would you be willing to continue? Same time next week?" "I would like that very much." Walking back to her uncle's shop afterward, Josephine felt lighter than she had in months. Someone wanted to learn from her, to understand her rather than change her. It was a revelation. Their Saturday lessons became a regular fixture. Over the following weeks, Quinton's attempted Cornish accent gradually improved, though it remained distinctly American underneath, which Josephine found endearing. More importantly, they talked. She learned that Quinton had left Missouri after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, that he had a younger sister married to a blacksmith in Kansas, that he dreamed of someday owning his own ranch. In turn, she shared memories of her mother teaching her to bake saffron cake, of her father singing old songs in the Cornish language he had learned from his grandmother, of the devastating moment when the mine accident stole him away, and then her mother's grief-stricken heart gave out months later. "You have been through so much," Quinton said quietly one afternoon. They had finished their lesson early and were walking along the banks of the Bear River that flowed near town. "And yet you remain kind. That takes strength." "Some days I do not feel very strong," Josephine admitted. "Some days I want to book passage back to England, even though there is nothing left for me there." "I am glad you have not," she glanced at him. "Are you?" "Yes." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "These past weeks, getting to know you, have been the best part of my summer. Maybe the best part of my year." Josephine's breath caught. They were standing close, closer than propriety strictly allowed. She could see the exact color of his eyes, green and gray swirled together like a storm brewing over the prairie. "Quinton," she began, but was not sure how to continue. "I know I am just a ranch foreman with dirt under his fingernails," he said. "And you are educated and well-spoken and deserve someone who can give you fine things. But I find myself thinking about you all the time, Josephine. I ride out to check the herd and I hear your voice explaining the difference between grass and gras. I see you in town and my whole day gets brighter. I am falling in love with you, and I needed you to know that, even if you do not feel the same." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "You think I deserve someone who can give me fine things. You do." "What I deserve," Josephine said slowly, "is someone who sees me as I am and does not want me to be anyone else. Someone who listens when I speak instead of mocking how I sound. Someone who makes me feel valued." She took a small step closer. "Someone exactly like you." The smile that broke across Quinton's face was like sunrise. "Does that mean?" "It means I am falling in love with you too." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. They stood there beside the river, holding hands like two young people who had found something precious and unexpected, while the water rushed past and cottonwood leaves rustled overhead. Their courtship became the talk of Evanston, though not in the way Josephine had feared. Quinton made no secret of his affection for her, and his respect in the community lent her a protection she had not previously enjoyed. When Frank the banker's son made another mocking comment about her accent at the general store, Quinton happened to be there. "Funny thing about accents," Quinton said conversationally, though his voice carried through the store. They tell you where someone has been, what they have survived to get here. Miss Ellis traveled across an ocean and halfway across a continent to make a new life after losing everyone she loved. What have you done, Frank, besides live off your father's money and make yourself unpleasant to hard-working people? Frank had no answer to that. Other people in the store nodded approvingly, and Josephine saw Mrs. Patterson, who had been so dismissive before, actually smile at her. The change was not universal or immediate, but it was real. More people made an effort to listen to what Josephine said rather than how she said it. Some even began to find her accent charming, exotic in a town where most voices sounded the same. By September, when the air turned crisp and the aspen leaves began to turn gold in the mountains, Quinton asked Josephine's uncle for permission to court her formally. Her uncle, who had watched his niece bloom from a lonely, mocked girl into a confident young woman, agreed readily. On a Sunday afternoon in October, Quinton took Josephine out to see the Double Creek Ranch. They rode together on his horse, Josephine seated in front of him with his arms bracketing her sides as he held the reins. She felt safe and warm despite the autumn chill. The ranch was beautiful, situated in a valley with mountains rising blue and purple in the distance. Cattle grazed on the brown grass, and the ranch house was a solid structure of logs and stone. Quinton's boss, an older rancher named Mr. Caldwell, greeted them warmly. "So this is the young lady I've been hearing about," Mr. Caldwell said, shaking Josephine's hand. "Quinton here cannot stop talking about you." "Sir," Quinton protested, embarrassed. Mr. Caldwell laughed. "It is good to see you happy, son. Come in, both of you. My wife will want to meet Miss Ellis properly." Over tea and fresh bread, Mrs. Caldwell asked Josephine about Cornwall, actually listening with genuine interest. She was a kind woman in her 50s who had come west from Ohio as a young bride and understood what it meant to leave everything familiar behind. "You have good instincts about people, Quinton," Mrs. Caldwell said when Josephine complimented the beautiful quilts hanging on the walls. "This one is a keeper." After tea, Quinton walked Josephine around the property, showing her the barn and corrals, introducing her to his favorite horses. The sun was setting when they finally climbed a small hill overlooking the ranch. "I have been saving money," Quinton said, staring out at the view. "Mr. Caldwell is getting older, thinking about selling in a few years. He has offered to sell me 100 acres on the eastern edge of the property, help me start my own herd. It would be small at first, but it would be mine." "Ours if you would have me." Josephine looked at him sharply. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have only known each other a few months. I know I should probably wait longer, be more patient. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Josephine Ellis. I love your strength and your kindness, and yes, I love every word that comes out of your mouth in that beautiful accent. I want to build a life with you, right here in this valley. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Quinton, I will marry you." He whooped with joy and spun her around, both of them laughing. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, gentle and sweet and full of promise. They married in November, a small ceremony at the church in Evanston with Josephine's uncle giving her away and Mrs. Caldwell standing up as matron of honor. Quinton's sister Martha traveled from Kansas with her husband, and Josephine was touched to gain family again after being alone for so long. Josephine wore a dress she had sewn herself from ivory fabric Mrs. Caldwell helped her choose, with lace at the collar that Martha contributed. She carried wildflowers dried and preserved from the summer prairie. When Quinton saw her walking down the aisle, his eyes shone with tears. The vows were traditional, but Quinton added his own words at the end. I promise to honor every part of you, including the voice that led me to fall in love with you in the first place." Josephine laughed through her own tears. "And I promise to always speak my truth to you, in whatever accent it comes out in." They moved into a small house on the Caldwell property while they saved to build on their own land. Josephine continued working at the hotel for a time, both for the income and because she enjoyed the work. But more and more, she found herself involved in ranch life, learning to cook for hired hands, helping with the accounts, even learning to ride properly. The first winter was hard, as Wyoming winters were, but they faced it together. Josephine learned to bake bread in a cast iron stove that heated their little house, while Quinton worked long hours ensuring the cattle survived the bitter cold and heavy snows. On quiet evenings, they sat by the fire, and Josephine would read aloud from books, her Cornish accent filling their home with music. Sometimes Quinton would practice along with her, making her laugh with his exaggerated attempts at getting the vowels just right. "You know," she said one night, tucked under a quilt with his arm around her, "you never really wanted to learn my accent, did you? That was just an excuse to spend time with me." Quinton smiled. "Can you blame me? You would not have agreed to lunch with me if I had just asked outright. You would have thought I was another person making fun. So you knew even then that you wanted to court me." "I knew I wanted to know you better," he admitted. "The courting part came after I realized how remarkable you are." "I am not remarkable. I am just a girl who talks differently." "You," Quinton said firmly, "are the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I thank God every day that you ended up in Evanston." In the spring of 1879, Quinton and Josephine broke ground on their own house on the land Mr. Caldwell had sold them. It was hard work, but neighbors pitched in, and by summer they had a sturdy two-room cabin with plans to expand as their family grew. They moved their few possessions in on a bright June day, and that night they christened their new home with laughter and love. Josephine discovered she was expecting a child in July. She told Quinton over breakfast, watching his face transform from confusion to understanding to pure joy. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. Mrs. Caldwell helped me figure out the signs. She thinks I am about 2 months along." Quinton came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby." "We are." Josephine buried her face in his shoulder, overwhelmed with happiness and fear. "I wish my mother were here. She would know what to do." "We will figure it out together," Quinton promised. "And Mrs. Caldwell will help. You are not alone anymore, Josephine. You have me and Martha if we need her, and you are going to be a wonderful mother." The pregnancy was relatively easy, though the summer heat made Josephine uncomfortable and tired. Quinton was endlessly solicitous, taking over her heavier chores and bringing her cool water from the creek. As autumn arrived and her belly swelled, neighbors began stopping by with gifts: tiny knitted blankets, carved wooden toys, a cradle that had rocked 3 generations of one family's children. "Folks around here have really taken to you," Mr. Caldwell observed one day when he and Quinton were mending fence. "Even the ones who were unkind before. You stood up to them with dignity, and Quinton stood up for you with respect. That means something in a place like this." The baby came in March of 1880, during a late winter storm that dumped 2 feet of snow and made travel impossible. Mrs. Caldwell had wisely come to stay a week before the due date, and she coached Josephine through a long, difficult labor while Quinton paced and prayed in the main room. When the baby finally arrived, wailing lustily, Mrs. Caldwell announced, "You have a son, a beautiful, healthy boy." Quinton rushed in and saw his wife, exhausted and radiant, holding a red-faced infant wrapped in soft flannel. "Josephine, oh my love, you did it." "We did it," she corrected weakly. "Come meet your son." They named him Thomas after Josephine's father. Thomas Vaughn had his mother's hazel eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the beginning he had a powerful voice that he was not afraid to use. Quinton proved to be a natural father, patient and loving, walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed and singing old Missouri songs that his own father had taught him. Josephine would nurse the baby in the rocking chair Quinton had made, singing Cornish lullabies her mother had sung to her. Sometimes she would cry, missing her parents desperately, wishing they could have met their grandson. But mostly she felt blessed beyond measure. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Quinton built their herd carefully, buying quality breeding stock and learning everything he could about ranching. Josephine kept their books, managed the household, and began taking in sewing to earn extra money. The territory of Wyoming was growing and changing, and they grew and changed with it. When Thomas was 2, Josephine gave birth to twin daughters, Emily and Grace. The births were easier this time, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and Mrs. Caldwell was there again to help. Quinton wept when he saw his daughters for the first time, 2 perfect little girls with their mother's fair coloring. 3 children, he marveled. Our house is going to be full of noise and love. And laundry, Josephine added with a tired laugh. So much laundry. They expanded the house, adding 2 bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Quinton hired 2 hands to help with the cattle, young men who ate at their table and became like family. The ranch was still small compared to some, but it was theirs, built on hard work and determination. Josephine's accent never fully faded, though it softened around the edges from years of living in Wyoming. The children grew up hearing both their mother's melodic Cornish-inflected English and their father's American drawl, code switching between them without thinking. Thomas, at age 5, delighted in making his mother laugh by imitating her pronunciation of certain words perfectly. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" a visiting rancher asked Thomas once. "From my mother," Thomas said proudly. "She is from Cornwall. That is in England across the ocean. She came all by herself when she was young, and now she teaches us how they talk there." The rancher looked at Josephine with new respect. That must have taken courage, coming to a strange country alone. "It did," Josephine agreed, "but I found a home here and a family. I would not change it for anything." When Wyoming achieved statehood in July of 1890, Evanston celebrated with a parade and festival. Quinton and Josephine brought their children into town, Thomas now 10 years old, and the twins 8. They watched the parade from the steps of the hotel where Josephine had once scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots. Mr. Griffith, the hotel manager who had asked her to talk normal all those years ago, stopped to greet them. He was grayer now, moving slower, but his handshake was still firm. "Mrs. Vaughn, good to see you, and your beautiful family." "Thank you, Mr. Griffith. It is a fine day for a celebration." "It is indeed. You know, I have been thinking lately about when you first came to work for me. I was not very kind about your accent. I want to apologize for that." "I was small-minded." Josephine was surprised but touched. "That is generous of you to say. It is only the truth. You were a good worker, and I should have judged you on that, not on how you sounded. Your husband was right to court you, and this town is better for having you in it." After he walked away, Quinton squeezed Josephine's hand. "See, I told you that you would win them over eventually. You won them over for me," she said, "by treating me like I was worth something when everyone else made me feel small." "You were always worth everything," Quinton said simply. "I just made sure other people noticed." That evening, after the children were in bed, Quinton and Josephine sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The house had been expanded again and was now a proper two-story home with a wide porch and sturdy barns. Their herd numbered over 200 head of cattle, and they employed 5 regular hands. It was more than Quinton had dreamed of when he first came to Wyoming, and far more than Josephine had imagined when she stepped off the train in Evanston, frightened and alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinton asked quietly. "Leaving England, ending up here?" "Not for a single moment," Josephine said. "I miss my parents. I wish they could have known you and the children. But this life we have built together is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I was thinking," Quinton said, "that maybe someday when the children are grown we could travel back to Cornwall together. I would like to see where you came from, walk the places you walked as a girl." Josephine smiled. "I would like that. You could meet my cousins if they are still there. See the sea cliffs and the fishing villages. Though I warn you, you would not understand half of what people say. The accent in some of the villages is even thicker than mine ever was." "Then you will have to translate for me," Quinton said. "Just like I had to learn your language when we first met." "You never learned my language," Josephine teased. "You learned just enough to convince me to have lunch with you." "And it worked, did it not?" He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. "Best decision I ever made, asking you to teach me to speak like you." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, a horse nickering in the barn, an owl calling from the cottonwoods by the creek. Inside, their children slept safely, and around them stretched the land they had worked so hard to make their own. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. Thomas grew into a serious young man who loved ranching as much as his father did. The twins developed distinct personalities. Emily was bold and adventurous, always wanting to ride fence with her father, while Grace was quieter and studious, spending hours with her mother learning to sew and keep accounts. In 1895, tragedy struck when Mr. Caldwell died suddenly of a heart attack. The loss hit the family hard, as he had been like a grandfather to the children and a mentor to Quinton. At the funeral, Quinton gave a eulogy that brought tears to everyone's eyes, speaking of the older man's kindness and wisdom, his willingness to give a young man a chance to prove himself. Mrs. Caldwell, now in her 70s and unable to manage the ranch alone, sold the remaining land to Quinton at a price so generous it was almost a gift. She moved into a small house in Evanston, where Josephine and the children visited her frequently. She lived 3 more years, long enough to see Thomas graduate from the territorial school and begin taking on more responsibility at the ranch. In 1898, when Thomas was 18, he fell in love with a rancher's daughter from the neighboring property. Sarah was a sweet girl with a practical nature and a genuine affection for Thomas. Josephine liked her immediately, seeing in Sarah some of her own determination and strength. "She reminds me of you," Quinton observed, watching Sarah help Josephine prepare dinner while Thomas looked on adoringly. "Smart, capable, not afraid of hard work." "She is good for him," Josephine agreed. "He needs someone who will challenge him, not just agree with everything he says." Thomas and Sarah married in the spring of 1899, and Quinton deeded them 50 acres on the western edge of the ranch to start their own spread. Watching her son stand at the altar with his bride, Josephine was overwhelmed by the passage of time. It seemed impossible that the tiny infant she had held in her arms was now a man starting his own family. "Where did the time go?" she whispered to Quinton during the ceremony. "I do not know," he whispered back, gripping her hand, "but I would not trade a single moment of it." The twins were 17 now, young women with their own dreams. Emily announced that she wanted to attend the new normal school in Laramie, to become a teacher. Grace surprised everyone by declaring her intention to study medicine, inspired by the new woman doctor who had recently opened a practice in Evanston. "Medicine is not really a woman's profession," a neighbor said doubtfully when Grace shared her plans. "It was not really a woman's role to run a ranch either," Josephine pointed out. "But I have been keeping our books and managing our household accounts for 20 years. Times are changing, and my daughters will change with them." Both girls left for their studies in the fall of 1900. The house felt empty without their chatter and laughter, but Josephine was proud beyond measure. Her daughters would have opportunities she had never had, would build lives of their own choosing. "You did that," Quinton said one evening as they ate dinner alone for the first time in years. "You showed them that being different, speaking differently, thinking differently is not a weakness. It is a strength." "We did that together," Josephine corrected. "You taught me that I did not have to change who I was to be valued. I just passed that lesson on to them." As the new century dawned, Quinton and Josephine found themselves entering a quieter phase of life. They were only in their 40s, still strong and healthy, but the ranch ran smoothly now with Thomas and the hired hands managing the day-to-day operations. They had time for each other in a way they had not since the early days of their courtship. They took long rides together, exploring parts of the valley they had been too busy to visit before. They read to each other in the evenings, everything from newspapers to novels. Josephine taught Quinton to appreciate poetry, while he introduced her to the adventure stories he loved. And always, they talked, sharing thoughts and dreams and memories. In 1903, Thomas and Sarah presented them with their first grandchild, a baby girl they named Josephine after her grandmother. Holding her tiny namesake, Josephine wept with joy and gratitude. She thought of her own mother, who had never had the chance to hold a grandchild, and silently promised to love this baby enough for both of them. Emily returned from Laramie with a teaching certificate and a fiancé, a young lawyer she had met at a lecture series. Grace came home less frequently, immersed in her medical studies, but she wrote long letters full of excitement about what she was learning. In 1905, when Josephine and Quinton celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary, they threw a party at the ranch that brought together neighbors from miles around. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, people gathered around asking them to share the story of how they met. "Tell us about the accent lessons," someone called out. It had become a local legend, the story of how Quinton had courted Josephine by asking her to teach him to speak like she did. Quinton pulled Josephine to her feet and wrapped his arm around her waist. "I was smitten from the first time I heard her speak," he said. "She sounded like music, like something rare and precious. And I thought, if I could just spend time with her, get to know her, maybe she would see that I was worth knowing too." "He told me he wanted to learn about the world beyond Wyoming," Josephine added. "He made me feel like my voice was something valuable instead of something to be ashamed of. That was the moment I started falling in love with him, though I did not realize it yet." "And now," someone asked, "after all these years, what is your secret?" Quinton looked at Josephine, his eyes still full of the same love and admiration they had held when he first asked her to teach him. "The secret is choosing each other every single day, seeing the best in each other even when times are hard. And never, ever taking for granted the precious gift of being loved by someone who accepts you exactly as you are." Josephine stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "That, and learning to communicate even when you speak different languages." Everyone laughed, and the party continued into the night. But later, when the guests had gone home and the house was quiet, Josephine and Quinton stood on their porch looking out at the land they had built a life on. "I have been thinking about that trip to Cornwall," Quinton said. Thomas can run the ranch for a few months. What do you say we finally take that journey? Josephine's breath caught. Really? You want to go? I do. I want to see where you came from, meet your family if any remain. And I want to show you that the girl who got off the train in Evanston all those years ago had nothing to be ashamed of. She was perfect exactly as she was. They booked passage for the summer of 1906. It was Josephine's first time back in nearly 30 years, and as the ship approached the Cornish coast, she gripped the railing with tears streaming down her face. The cliffs, the sea, the very quality of the light was exactly as she remembered. They stayed for 2 months, and Josephine reconnected with cousins she had not seen since childhood. Quinton charmed everyone with his earnest attempts to understand the thick Cornish accents in the fishing villages, and Josephine found herself translating for him just as she had once feared she would need him to translate for her in Wyoming. They visited her parents' graves and laid fresh flowers. Josephine told them about their grandson and granddaughters, about the life she had built in America, about the good man she had married. And though it was bittersweet, there was healing in it too. On the ship back to America, Josephine said, "Thank you for bringing me home." "Wyoming is your home," Quinton said gently. "It is now," she agreed. "But I needed to see that this place still exists, that I did not imagine it. I needed to make peace with everything I left behind so I could fully embrace everything I gained." They returned to the ranch to find that Sarah was expecting again, and Emily was pregnant with her first child. Grace had completed her medical training and was preparing to open a practice in Cheyenne. The family was growing, spreading, becoming something bigger than Quinton and Josephine had imagined when they first started out. Years continued to pass. Thomas and Sarah eventually had 4 children, and the ranch grew to encompass nearly 1,000 acres. Emily had 3 children and continued teaching, beloved by generations of students. Grace became one of the most respected doctors in Wyoming, specializing in women's and children's health. Quinton and Josephine grew older together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming gnarled from years of hard work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something as essential and enduring as the mountains themselves. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The party was held at the ranch, now run by Thomas, but still belonging to the whole family. People came from across the state to honor the couple who had built something lasting out of courage and love. The local newspaper sent a reporter to interview them. "What advice would you give to young couples just starting out?" the reporter asked. Josephine and Quinton looked at each other, that silent communication of couples who have spent a lifetime together. "Listen to each other," Josephine said. "Really listen, not just to the words but to what is underneath them. Everyone speaks a different language of the heart. Learning to understand your partner's language is the work of a lifetime. And choose kindness," Quinton added, "even when you are tired or frustrated or scared, especially then. Kindness is what carries you through." The reporter scribbled notes. "I understand your love story started with language lessons, with you learning to speak like your wife did," Quinton smiled. "That was the excuse I used to spend time with her. But really, I was trying to learn to see the world the way she saw it, to understand what made her unique and special. And she taught me that, though it took a lot longer than a few Saturday lunches." "He taught me something too," Josephine said softly. "He taught me that I did not have to lose myself to belong somewhere, that the right people would love me for who I was, not despite it. That was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me." As twilight fell and the celebration wound down, Josephine and Quinton retreated to the porch swing they had installed decades earlier. Their bodies were old now, aching in places that had worked hard for many years, but their hearts were young. "Do you remember the first time we sat here?" Josephine asked. "I remember everything," Quinton said. "Every conversation, every look, every moment that led us to this place." "I love you," Josephine said in Cornish, using the phrase she had taught him so many years ago. It was one of the few things he had truly mastered, practicing it over and over until he could say it perfectly. "I love you too," he responded in the same language, his accent still a bit rough but the meaning crystal clear. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged, listening to the sounds of their family inside the house. Grandchildren's laughter, the low murmur of adult conversation, the clatter of dishes being washed. The sounds of a life well lived, a family well loved, a legacy that would endure. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible, a train whistle blew as the evening service passed through Evanston, carrying new arrivals to town just as it had carried a frightened, lonely girl from England nearly 52 years before. Josephine listened to that whistle and smiled, thinking of how far she had come, how much she had gained, how richly blessed her life had been, all because one cowboy had looked past what made her different and seen instead what made her extraordinary. All because he had said, "Teach me to speak like you," and in doing so had taught her that she was worth listening to. As they sat together in the gathering dark, their hands intertwined, Josephine Ellis Vaughn and Quinton Vaughn were content. Their story had been written day by day, choice by choice, and it had become something beautiful. A testament to the power of love to transform lives, to the strength found in embracing what makes us unique, and to the truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple request and a willing heart. The years eventually caught up with them both. Quinton passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1932, at the age of 78. He died in the home he had built, surrounded by family, with Josephine holding his hand. His last words were in Cornish, telling her he loved her one final time. Josephine lived 3 more years, long enough to see Thomas's eldest son take over the ranch, ensuring that the Vaughn legacy would continue into the next generation. She spent those years sharing stories with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making sure they knew where they came from and what their grandfather had been like. She talked about Cornwall and the journey that had brought her to Wyoming. She talked about the mockery she had faced and how Quinton had seen past it to the person she truly was. She taught them Cornish words and phrases, kept the language alive in their family as a reminder of their heritage. Most importantly, she taught them that love was about acceptance, about celebrating differences rather than trying to erase them. That the strongest bonds were built between people who could learn each other's languages, whether those languages were English or Cornish or simply the unspoken communication of 2 hearts beating as one. Josephine died in the spring of 1935, on a morning when the wildflowers were just beginning to bloom on the prairie. She was buried beside Quinton on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. On her gravestone, beneath her name and dates, the family had inscribed a line in Cornish that translated to, "She spoke with courage and was heard with love." The ranch continued to prosper through the generations. Thomas's children and grandchildren raised cattle and horses, stewards of the land their great-grandparents had claimed. They told and retold the story of Josephine and Quinton, of the English girl with the mocked accent and the cowboy who had asked her to teach him to speak like she did. It became a family legend, a reminder that love could bridge any divide, that kindness and acceptance were worth more than conformity, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the simplest acts of courage. The story of a woman who refused to lose herself and a man who loved her exactly as she was. And together they built something that would last far beyond their years. And in Evanston, Wyoming, in the schools where Emily's descendants taught and the hospitals where Grace's legacy of compassionate care continued, people still remembered. They remembered the woman from Cornwall who had faced mockery with dignity, and the cowboy who had seen her true worth. They remembered a love story that had transformed not just two lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to belong. The Vaughn family ranch still stands, over a century and a half after Josephine first arrived in Evanston. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispers through the cottonwoods and the stars shine bright over the Wyoming prairie, you can almost hear an echo of two voices, one lilting and melodic with the music of Cornwall, the other strong and steady with the cadence of the American West, both speaking the same language of enduring love.